All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Natalia, and I work on merge algorithms at Stitch Fix. And it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker for the Stitch Fix Algo Hour, Michelle Carney. And a little personal history. I first met Michelle about 10 years ago, back when she was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, and I was a wee grad student. And we were working on research projects in the same computational neuroscience group. And even back then, I was really amazed and inspired by how much boundless energy Michelle had and how much creativity she put in her different projects. And that's only grown through the time I've known her. She's a connector of people, of ideas. Her work bridges disciplines in really unique ways. She has now transitioned from computational neuroscience to user research, user experience research. And her practice focuses on the intersection of data science and UX in particular. She's a senior UX researcher on Google's AI UX team. She has worked on People AI Research projects, the Tone Transfer project for Magenta, which is a project that explores machine learning for creating art and music. And outside of work, Michelle has founded and organizes the Machine Learning and UX Meetup, which is really fantastic. You should all check it out. She also teaches at the Stanford D School, where she developed a course on designing machine learning, and lots of resources from that are available open source as well. I was really fortunate to work on some projects with Michelle right before lockdown. We collaborated in a workshop for the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning Conference in Barcelona in February, back when we traveled for conferences. We also organized an event for Queer and AI at the conference. I'm really excited to have Michelle here today to share with us on building machine learning products for people, on user experience research and machine learning systems. And Michelle, take it away.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Natalia. That was such a kind intro. And as Natalia mentioned, so she was like the cool grad student and I was like the lowly undergrad. So I've always super looked up to Natalia. So thank you for your super kind words. I'm super stoked to be here today and to share this with y'all. I think I've been mentioning as people were coming in and welcoming them, I did already tweet out this resource list in advance. So Natalia, if you wouldn't mind just sharing the link again, so that way everyone can kind of have it. If there's anything that you find interesting, feel free to open it up in a new tab. You won't hurt my feelings by scrolling on other stuff. So like, it's cool. But yeah, so today I'm going to be sharing a little bit about like my best practices and like how I kind of approach this intersection of machine learning and user experience. And I've kind of distilled like how myself as a UX researcher approaches brand new ML products and like how do I kind of tap into that UX research skill set and really make sure that we're building the right types of products for people. So yeah, super excited to share kind of that overall case study. But first, maybe a little bit about me. So yes, hi, I'm Michelle. I look like that. Yeah, senior UXR at Google AI. I run a meetup. You are invited. Everyone's invited. Come on down. We're kind of wrapped up for the year, but maybe for next year, MLUX Meetup. And you could follow us here, Michelle R. Carney. Sometimes I joke that the R stands for like the programming language R, back when I used to teach data science. So that, and then my students were like, oh my God, you're really into data science. And I'm like, haha, now you won't forget. Or MLUX Meetup. But yes, I also kind of wanted to share for the folks in the room who, wherever you are in your journey, I just wanted to share like my journey. So if there's any point like you want to chat more about any of this, please do reach out and I'm happy to schedule an office hours or chat about this too. But as Natalia mentioned, I started my career at UC Berkeley. I did computational neuro. I was really interested in, how do we make models, machine learning models that did a lot of auditory scene analysis, filtering signal versus noise for like cochlear implant algorithms, but also behavioral models. And then I quickly realized, oh no, getting a PhD is long and scary. I gotta go find something else. So I actually started teaching coding, full stack engineering out here in the East Bay in Oakland. And that's actually how I landed my first job at Visa's innovation team, where I was doing UX engineering as well as, because I had a background in running research labs, I helped them start up their research facility. It was really cool, definitely a lot more qualitative. And I was like, oh wait, I really am missing that data science side of it. So that's why I went back to grad school at the UC Berkeley School of Information, where I kind of focused in this machine learning, data science, and UX intersection, basically taking classes, like really intense classes in machine learning, but applied to like UX problems, like clustering type stuff to build out personas, for instance. So super cool. If you're interested in grad schools, happy to chat about that one. And from there, I landed my first role in ML and UX at Amazon Music. So I was there for a little over 2 years, exploring interactive visualizations for machine learning, helping our designers understand data and do better informed designs based off of that data, all this really cool stuff. And just recently, a little over a year ago, I joined Google AI, actually the larger team that helps run the Pair Guidebook. I had a celebrity crush on the Pair Guidebook, which I'm going to share in a little bit. So it's such a thrill to be on this team. And like Natalia mentioned, my most recent project was Tone Transfer, which was with Google's Magenta, which is an open source AI music and creativity platform. So definitely check that out. It makes a lot of sound, so you probably can't hear me if you're also doing it. So I'll tweet that out later too. But yeah. So for those of you who might have already seen one of my talks too, I just kind of wanted to ground this discussion in, like, I'm going to be sharing a lot of the same things that I did for the Dscout talk, but it's going to be a very similar case study. And so if you're interested in reading it, I've also tweeted out the whole blog format of it as well. And yes, I have actually already tweeted out, like, go follow _Algo if you haven't already. And then look, hi there, it's me. I tweeted out the following link. So like, there it is, ta-da. 1 second ago, probably, who knows. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what is machine learning and UX. Then I'm going to talk about the Pair Guidebook. And then I'm going to go lead into a case study. I've kind of, like I mentioned, have reflected on how I approach UXR for machine learning, and I'm going to walk you through how I normally approach it. So what is machine learning in UX? Well, how I like to think about it is, how do we use data science techniques in order to inform and drive UX design decisions? So like, what's actually happening in the data, whether that's like as simple as just visualizing it to more complex, like even regressions or predictability or models, or like I mentioned, unsupervised learning on UI click metrics and everything too, to find those like clusters of behaviors to make a better user experience. But also, how do we design our experiences around really data intensive experiences in general to be more transparent to the end user about what's actually happening with their data, how is it being used, what can they control, how can they impact the model and the options that they're being served, all that stuff too. And for all the folks in the room, I feel like I might have to just say this, like, UX is so much more than just visual design. I identify as much more of a user experience person, UX researcher, but you can see on my slides, I'm not very good at visual design. This is all black and white. So it's really about what is the experience of the product, what is the experience that your user is going through. Could be also in the copywriting, the information architecture, all that stuff too. And the data side of it as well, that is like super simplified, and you will hear me use machine learning, AI, data science, even statistical inference, kind of all melded together, because truly that's what it feels like for the end user. They don't know the difference between like a for loop and it actually being powered by AI. It's all like amorphous to them. So when those two disciplines come together, they make really cool experiences like this. I love this because it's a gift from Pinterest where, like, I have no idea what they're searching for still to this day. They get something with like beaches and peaches and pizzas, and they're like, pizzas, search further. But like, they don't have to actually go up into the search bar to search further. They could just click on the lower right-hand corner of the image, and it can reseed the search right there, which I think is really clever. And like, even without knowing how this is happening on the ML side, whether that's computer vision, and like, you can imagine every card has like 3 other recommended things to populate the screen that looks similar to that, or if that's NLP, where it's like looking at the tags of like pizza or food or whatever that is, it just feels like a really cool experience, and you're getting to like what your goal is, which is, I want to see more examples like this, right? Another example of this too is I really love NLP type stuff. And so like, this is like someone texting saying, I got into law school, let's party. And then it like populates the GIF keyboard and like gives you the option to choose whether or not you want to send a GIF and everything too, where it's like, hey, this is machine learning. It can help, but also you don't need to do it right now. So I just think that that's a really clever example of the Google keyboard. And the last one from the visual design side is the Google's Quick Draw and Auto Draw examples. So basically, I don't know how many of you know of Quick Draw, but it was like a game where you had like 20 seconds in order to draw a given idea. So like a lightning bolt, and you had to draw it really quickly. And then they use that training data to train a model to kind of identify when you go into auto draw what you're trying to draw. And it makes suggestions as to, hey, here's a clip art by another artist that might look similar or whatever. And sometimes when I do demos, I like draw an octopus and say like, welcome to my octopus garage sale or whatever. Anyways, very cool. It's also in Google Slides now. The other one that I kind of wanted to call out that I don't typically do, but because this is like a data science intensive group, is this really fantastic talk by one of my colleagues, Andrea Gagliano. She is the head of data science at Getty Images. And she did this fantastic talk for us back before the lockdown in February up in Seattle. And, you know, as the head of data science at Getty Images, she recognizes the responsibility of like what we have a role in showing diversity in our image sets. Like banks come to us, hospitals come to us for clip art or whatever kind of like background stock photos. We need to make sure that these images represent a world that, you know, is diverse enough. But like for the example of nurses, is that, you know, showing diversity in the sense of the general population, or do we only focus on nurses? Or do we show like a mixed world where it's like a hypothetical where we want to go? Because currently, I believe that she quoted the US Census of like 80% or more of nurses are female. And so like, is that something that we should be re-amplifying? Or is this something too where like we show an ideal world where it's potentially balanced? Same thing with doctors. Like if you search for doctors, how come a lot of those times the photos tend to be old white men? Like what about other types of doctors and everything too? So I think these are really interesting provocations, and I invite you to join us at MLUX. We have talks like this all the time. Not saying that there's a right answer, but these are things that we are thinking about. So like I mentioned, I actually go into detail in all these examples and more in this What is Machine Learning plus UX article. Again, I tweeted it out, but if you'd like to read more, check it out there. And that also links to like Andrea's talk and everything too. So that's about the discipline of MLUX, but what about the meetup? So we actually are a group of people. I know it's kind of like amorphous, and we also use the same branding of like MLUX and like MLUX, but like we're more of a community collective. It's fine, just come on down, show up, we're free. It started as like what I thought was gonna be a 30-person pizza party. A little over 3 years ago. And by our second event, we had like 200 folks showing up. And I was like, oh, whoa, this is a lot of people. So since then, we've been able to do a lot of really cool events, and all of them are free. And we're moving to virtual events as well. So hope to see you at some of the future events. I saw some of the other folks we've actually met in person at prior MLUX events. So and we're also on all of the platforms, except for maybe TikTok. But like, if you want to follow us on LinkedIn, because that's where your favorite place is, great. We do also show our previous talks too. We try to record them and post them on our MLUX YouTube channel, as well as on our Twitter at MLUX Meetup. But truly, our vision is to create a collaborative environment for UXers, data scientists, and everyone in between. And it really is to organize a community that helps foster that cooperation, sharing best practices across disciplines. And like, I strongly believe in the leadership group, which Natalia has joined us too, believes that it's not going to be like one company that like solves this. We're all approaching it in different ways, and that's great. And so how do we have a space where we can then share back these resources, as well as like have a conversation about like what works as well as what doesn't work? So yes, that's kind of like our goal in hosting these events. And we typically do tech talks, so things where we can learn from other folks about those best practices or case studies, and semi-regular networking happy hours. We tend to do them after our virtual events, so like the half hour after. If you want to meet more people, you can. And check us out, Twitter, YouTube, Medium, LinkedIn, you name it, we're probably on it. Not TikTok though. I can say this all I want, but I think that it's important to actually take a look at some of our events. So like I mentioned, we've been in Seattle, we've also been up in New York, and all over the place, and with folks like Feminist AI, Ladies at UX, as well as more technical events like AI for social good and data-driven personas, startups, which are a lot smaller and everything too. So like what happens if you're at a startup and you want to do data science, but you don't have any data? Like we've talked about that. So super excited for that. And just thank you to all of our other, like we couldn't do this without our sponsors. And so these companies and individuals from these companies actually volunteer their time and actually pay for these events and food and everything too. So just thank you to helping us get where we are today. So yeah. I will say 3 years ago, when I was really interested in this, before, like when we were first starting the meetup, so many people were like, wait, ML and UX, those don't go together. Those are two separate job categories. Like those are two verticals that don't communicate, blah. But like, I'm super excited because in the last year alone, we've started seeing jobs pop up like this data science practice at IDEO, which is a traditionally design company, and like how they approach prototyping with data or prototyping data science experiences, I think is really cool and really powerful. As well as like jobs like this, I'm just going to highlight it. This is from Apple, but a UX UI designer to bridge the gap between design and machine learning. Like what? Oh my gosh, it's here. The future is here. We did our job. Good job, MLUX. But no, I think like my hot take is that I think it's going to kind of be like when people were like mobile designers, and at first you like specify that you're a mobile designer, and then everyone's just kind of is like assume that you just also like do mobile now. However, I think that we need to raise the bar for the UX designers in the field to make them feel confident to design for AI and machine learning, as well as like our data science counterparts who are suddenly having to work with design. Like, how do we understand how to build these holistic experiences, designing for feedback, and all that other stuff too. There's also been a huge rise of resources, which I'm so stoked about. Here's just like a couple of them. I will say, like, I've also written about a lot of my favorite resources, including like case studies from companies like Spotify and Google. This is like the Google one. And Salesforce also has quite a few case studies, which I think are pretty good. So if you want to read about how other companies are approaching this, or if you have other examples that you'd like to share with me, I'm happy to kind of add this to there. Including what's on there is the Stitch Fix algorithms tour. I just want to say, like, I am so floored to be here because, like, that is one of my favorite resources of all time. I was just telling Brian and Natalia this. I think that it's such a great way for people who don't necessarily have a background in machine learning and AI to kind of understand and like play with it and kind of see what parts are algorithmically driven versus like where the human in the loop kind of comes in to make those annotations. So just thank you for making that great resource. I'm a huge fan. So that's on that list. Take a look, and yeah. The other thing that's on the list that I really, really love is the PAIR guidebook. Oh, there we go. So the People AI Research team is a group at Google AI. I'm not directly on that team. I work a lot with them. And it is, I'm going to be totally honest, one of the major reasons why I came to Google. Like, I just am such a fan of what they are doing. The TLDR is like, they got like dozens, maybe hundreds of people in the room, like way before I joined, to like brainstorm, like, if we were to make guidelines around how to develop the best AI or design the best AI products, what would that look like? And so they like mind melded and came up with like these 6 chapters. And I would say it does not read like a normal book. So like, don't feel like you have to start with like defining user needs and all this stuff too. Instead, like, just think about where you are in your own process and then kind of like pick and choose what you think is interesting. I'm going to cover 3 of them today, which I think are under talked about whenever I do UX research, and kind of like some things from their worksheets that I think are really valuable and that I actually was using before I even saw the guidebook. So starting first with mental models. I think it's so important when you are designing machine learning and AI to think about your user's point of view. Like, what are they coming into this experience with? Like, it's so easy to kind of be like, oh, yes, like this AI just recommends whatever. But it's like, yes, but when does it recommend it and why and how? And like all these other things too, like how is the user actually going to engage with this and everything as well? especially important when we are thinking about like what are the pros and cons of introducing our AI as human-like, I think is really big. So like so much of the times when we build chatbots, I don't know if anyone on the line does a lot of chatbot stuff, but like it's pretty easy for the nice happy paths to be like, yes, this is a chatbot and it does this and it feels great. And like, this is the great happy path. But what if someone thinks that it's a human and then tries to ask you something as if it were a human? It's like, I don't get that. And it's like frustration cycle to the extreme. And so like, how do we build to help them understand what this system is able to do? And how do we explain like the limitations of the system too, I think is also really important. How it changes over time, just not only to help your system succeed, but also the user succeed in whatever their task is. So that's something I think about all the time when I do user research. The other chapter that I want to call out is on feedback and control. And I think this is really important too when so much of the time when we are making models, we don't have the exact data source that we're going to use down the line or something too, like especially when we're developing something new. So we might use like proxy data with the hopes of like collecting new training data and then improving the system. And so like, how do we design ways to collect that feedback and let users know what they can control about the system? And there's like also this like balance too between like implicit and explicit user feedback that I think is really interesting, where it's like, well, what are we thinking as all the signals for this? Like for instance, if we were to think about a Markov decision process or something around reinforcement learning, we could think like literally what are the state action reward spaces of all the things that we're doing right now? What are the actions that the user can take? How much does that reward? Does an explicit feedback reward it more versus an implicit feedback? So something as in like clicking on it versus buying it, for instance, right? Like where do we balance that and how do we give that signal back to our future data that we're going to be training on? So that's something I think about a lot when I do user research on models is like, how do you want to change this? Like, what would you do if it was wrong? And the last thing that I want to call out, the last chapter is on errors and failing gracefully. I love this so much because machine learning is probabilistic. Therefore, there will always be times when it fails. So it's important to design knowing that it's going to fail. And what happens? How do you recover once it fails? And I think all of us have experienced a machine learning failure at some point where like, whether that's an autocomplete where it says, I know whenever I say happy for the longest time, it was going happy Thanksgiving, even when it was like spring or something. And I was like, wait, what? Like, and then like my process is like thrown off and all this stuff too. So like, how do we get people back on track? Is that like they can give feedback to the system? How do we show when something might be like, we're not quite sure if this is the right word, but like maybe there's something else that you could use? Do we like, I think one of the designs on the type ahead is like you click on it and it shows other options and stuff too. And then like, how does I think the biggest one that I just kind of want to call out as like a seed of or question or thought for you to take away is like, how does your AI allow users to move forward after an AI failure? Like how are you going to make sure that they can still complete their task? You don't want something where it's like, oh, they've given, a bit some pieces of data throughout the process, like, oh, I'm booking a trip and, I want to go here and all this other stuff. And then they're like, oh, we don't have any flights for that. It's like, well, but I still want to book a trip. Can you show me other options or something like that too? So just thinking about that too when you're going ahead and building other things. So on that note, that was like a very high level summary of like 3 of the 6 chapters. And like they have like really in-depth examples as well as worksheets that you can use with your team. So definitely take a look there. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up really quickly with a case study, which is my favorite part about this talk. It's really like, I want to emphasize that this is not a product that I have directly worked on. This is more like a reflection and summary of a lot of different projects that I've worked on. And I've kind of synthesized how I approach UX research on early stage ML really is like, the ideal time for me is like before you've even built the ML model, like how can I come in and help guide that process? And hopefully, just like with the pair guidebook, there's going to be some parts that really resonate with you and some parts that, you might just be like, hey, we're not there. That's okay. So we are going to pretend that we work for a startup that does personalized travel. ML. So my typical process when I'm working with these ML teams is that I tend to think of my research in like 3 major steps. The first one is like generative research, which is like starting out with like, let's explore the space. What are some other options that we can think of? Especially so much of the time, machine learning, when I'm working on it, is like, there isn't even another competitor or offering. Like this is like a brand new thing. And so like, how do we like open this up as to like, what is the problem we're truly solving for? Then evaluating your concept. This could be moderated. It also doesn't need to have ML. And that's really just testing out the North Star of like, am I building the right type of experience? And double checking that, triple checking that before you invest the time and energy of your machine learning team to actually like build it. And then the last part is evaluating your prototypes. So now you've built your ML model and like, how do you get that feedback and improve on that? So starting quickly with generative research, this could take so many different forms, could be like crazy eights, could be whatever. I'm just gonna give a very quick example. Like hypothetically, if you were building a, like an AI assistant modality, let's just say for travel, you might actually have people come into a room and recommend travel to each other and just observe like what stands out to you about like how 2 humans might recommend travel to each other. Maybe they're asking things like, you know, are you traveling with more than one person? Is it your family? Like, do they want activities? Or maybe it's something too where it's like, oh, I need to be able to travel at the drop of a hat. Like, I don't care where I go, but like I'm constantly working. So when I have a 3-day weekend, I just need to book it that night or something like that. And so like, looking at understanding like the context around these recommendations is really important. And because you don't want to just design for what we currently have with machine learning, we can actually start gathering up other things or ways that people might perceive or have mental models that we aren't gaining from other systems. So that's a really important thing to kind of think about. Even if you don't make those things, you can at least be aware like, hey, you know, when I book on Kayak, we don't ask like, are you traveling with small children or like anything like that. But that is something that's a main goal of mine when I book travel or something. And it's super important to do before you do any like further concepts. It's just like explore this domain, understand how people approach this. This is the mental model side of it. One way that I've also seen work really well, and I've posted this in the resource thread, is the triptych methodology. But it's basically using storyboards to kind of understand like how common is this problem, and then like how likely are you to want the solution, or like what are some things that you would change. And that really is helpful for directionality about like, oh, actually like, you know, booking travel with a family isn't the problem. It's actually like getting everyone to the airport, or like, just like, is this something that you're just totally missing the box? Like this is not even an AI app or something, right? So spending some time there, even if it's just like a week, can help save you so much time down the line, because you will have learned so much about the domain that you're actually building for. The next phase that I tend to move into is like synthesizing all of that stuff from the generative research and thinking about like, hey, what are the major triggers? Let's just say from travel, it was like, what dates are you available? You know, what types of places do you like to go to? Is it cities? Is it remote? Who are you going with? You know, like those tended to be the conversations that folks were recommending to each other. And so we might go build a concept around that. Like, oh, these are the top 3 things. Let's go now test it with people. I prefer to do this moderated and in person, because this is still so early and exploratory. It's really nice to ask people like, but why? Like, why are you telling me this? What else is it missing? What else do you want to see? And one way to do this too, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, is a Wizard of Oz style test, where basically you can simulate that an AI is happening, but really you have someone in another room. Like if this is like a voice assistant or something, they might be typing out via Bluetooth onto the speaker, and it sounds like it's talking, but it's not. It's actually someone typing, but you're testing out if that interaction makes sense. Or it could be like a chatbot, and you also have someone texting that out. And the big part is you actually don't need any ML yet. You can have your ML team working on this in parallel. You are truly there to test the North Star of the experience. Like you have to understand, what are the inputs going to be for this ML model? What are the anticipated outputs for this model? And does that make sense? Does this like jive with the mental model about what to expect? If I give it like my dates that I'm available, who I'm traveling with, is that going to be enough for me to get a solid recommendation back? And remember, this is just a very simple example of travel. you can imagine with your own domains as to other things there. So for this evaluating the concept, what I actually will do is I'll create custom prototypes too for each participant if I truly want to create like a personalized recommender experience that I'm testing out. And how I do that, I create a survey as a part of the screener where I ask folks, the typical things of like, hey, when are you available to come into the lab? Have you used N type of devices in the last like couple weeks? How many devices do you have in your home? What are the top 3 places you want to travel? What are the top 3 places you don't want to travel? What was the place you traveled to last? Or, just understanding too, and telling them in the survey, like, hey, this might be used to inform the prototype is also super important. So yes, ask questions that can inform the prototype in that screener survey. And so understanding not only like, hey, who's available, and like maybe you want to be sure that you're sampling a large enough demographic too, of like, I want folks from a bunch of different age ranges or a bunch of different locations or something like that as well. So that way you're understanding like, hey, for all these different types of people, if I were to build a custom experience for them, would this actually work? The other thing that I really want to stress is like, this is getting into those errors and failing gracefully. It's okay if it's not perfect. Like you don't need to get the perfect like fake prototype already made, because ML is sometimes wrong. And so it actually might be to your benefit. And I would ask typically some questions around like, hey, what are some places you would never want to travel to? Because they're probably going to get that at some point. And like, what do they do in response to that? So, ta-da, we've built it, our concept, our prototype that is informed by the generative research. And some things that I might do too is only wire up the first kind of like half of the screen, because, if we don't need to test the bottom part, you could just be like, imagine these are also AI generated, but it's more of the same. And so the other thing is too, I might only wire up like one of them. So clicking on LA and then having that open, they might say something like, I want to go to Paris or something. And I'd be like, okay, let's pretend we click on LA though. And so I think like this supports this level of fidelity of the prototype, where it doesn't need to be like, you could still imagine like, hey, let's pretend like this said Paris, but it's actually just going to say LA. It's just a prototype. We're just going to walk through it. What do you expect? So let's say this person in their survey, they said, I love big cities, big metropolitan cities, LA, Paris, New York. I never want to go to Roswell. I don't like aliens. And I'm like, okay, cool. This is great. This is what the prototype is going to be. And so asking them questions around like, hey, how did these things get there? They might focus in on that Roswell and be like, oh, my brother uses my account sometimes, and it's just so frustrating that he, I wish there was an incognito mode, or like there was something else where he could use it and we could share an account, or like, and so that gives you insight as to like why they think this poor recommendation showed up. This is, of course, a silly example, but you might imagine let's just say we were working in music and like people are like, I'm really into country. And it's like, their version of country is like Taylor Swift and Dixie Chicks. And then all of a sudden Johnny Cash shows up and they're like, that's not country to me, but like that's someone else's country, right? And so like understanding kind of like, hey, like, why is this here? Maybe it's in relation to all these others. No, maybe like the algorithm's trying to tell me to go somewhere outside of a major city, or just getting those mental models as to why they think that is occurring. And then clicking through to be like, okay, are all these features enough? Like, would you think would happen if you would hard it? How would you remove the Roswell one too? So with that being said, here are my typical questions when I evaluate the concept. I always start with, is this what you expected? Like, what are your thoughts? Is this what you expected? How does the model know this? How did the model get this information? What happens when the model's wrong? How do you give the system feedback? Would you expect to like long press on it? Would you expect to like, what if you traveled to this place and like you wanted to remove it? All this stuff. How could you change it? Also, like, another big thing that we should be testing out that I don't feel like is tested out enough is understanding how ML models would change over time. And so like, what happens if you've used this a lot? And like, does it update? Does it change? Do you like, how does it adapt to changes in behavior? And like, what do you want to see in 6 months from now? That kind of thing. So great, we've done all this. We have thought long and hard. We tested this out with like a good number of people and we're like, okay, this is worth it. We're going to go and build it. We understand what the inputs are. We understand how to design for the outputs. We can get it all wired up. So this is the part where you kind of hand it off to the ML team to go and you like work with them. You're like, oh, cool, that works, that doesn't. And you try like edge cases and you like try to be your different types of users. But you build a prototype, and that's the biggest thing. This is where you truly do need ML to catch those, like where it's working well and where it's not. So this could even be like an MVP of your ML prototype too, where you're like, hey, you know, it might work on the back end, but it might not be right all the time or anything too, but you're pretty confident in it. How I like to do this is actually unmoderated. So what that means, moderated in the previous case with evaluating the concept is me actually sitting with the person and understanding what they're doing or not doing, or, you know, during the time of COVID, I'll do it remotely and stuff too, but I'm still asking them, like, how does the model know? What are you doing next? All this stuff too. However, with the unmoderated evaluating of the prototype, that one I will just send to them. And I might ask them at first to be like, hey, can you show me how you typically book a travel app? That's a contextual inquiry where I'm just kind of understanding what a typical booking of a travel experience might look like. And then actually give them access to like a prototype or something like that and have them share their screen or whatever that looks like of like, hey, is this working for you? What would you want to change and why? And it's also, you could do this at scale, unmoderated at scale. Like I only have one of me and I work 8 hours a day or try to. However, when you do a large scale unmoderated one, you can really just send it out to a lot of people, whether that's usertesting.com or whatever, and just kind of see like how they give feedback on like, oh, I would have expected to ask that or answer that way or something like that, or how is it actually not working for them? Just to wrap this up and everything too, as I mentioned, I would typically ask something around a control condition, like how do you currently plan trips? Show me a couple examples of that. So I have a baseline as to like what they are expecting when booking travel. Then an experimental condition is actually giving them access to the prototype in some shape or form, Envision, Sketch, Gallery, doesn't really matter, as long as like they can click through, or if best case is actually use the model and try it themselves. And then reflection, like what are your thoughts? What are feedback? What are ways that you were thinking that this was actually going to be better, or ideas that you had that you were hoping that it would do? As I mentioned, this was a talk for Dscout, so I typically actually would use Dscout to do this. So huge shout out because I really like their platform. And so this is a screenshot of like the Dscout app. And so it feels a little bit like Snapchat meets Qualtrics for the user, in the sense that they are easily able to capture video, but they also answer some survey questions around like, oh, why are you booking this? Who else are you booking it with? Which really helps you in actually analyzing that data, because they're answering some of those survey questions that can be categorical as well. And so then if you want to group like, oh, this is for a family trip versus like a solo work trip or whatever that looks like, you can kind of compare those behaviors. So this is a screen recording where they go ahead and talk about what they're hoping to do for travel. And then I won't play this, but you know, for the experimental could be something where they are doing a selfie style, or maybe they actually try, I've done it with you know, hardware too, where they actually capture how they typically are trying to do things with their hardware device as well, which I thought was great. And then also like reflecting, having typing out a little bit more about like, what do you think, you know, given your current way of booking things, how do you think we could change this or improve it? So yeah, that's just kind of like the overall process that I go through when I'm designing those studies. And again, that fits into that larger, like, okay, this is like not like a 1 week UXR. This is like a 6 to 9 months, maybe a year kind of process of UX research, starting with that generative research, then evaluating that North Star, that concept, like, does this even make sense for users? And then actually spending the time with your team to build it and test it. So I know that we want to leave 15 minutes for questions, so I will just wrap up with like, hey, this is cool. Are you interested in learning more? Great. Totally check out the PAIR website. Oh, go away, Google Slides thing. Okay, well, it's pair.withgoogle.com. Is it going to go away? No, probably not. Oh, there we go. Pair.withgoogle.com. like I mentioned, I don't work directly on this team. I'm just a huge fan. But some of the things that I love about it are the guidebook, which we've already talked about. I think it's awesome. They've revamped it. It has worksheets. You could do it with your team. Really cool. But they also have like AI explorables, which are also a really great way, similar to like how I was telling Brian that I use the Stitch Fix algorithms tour to kind of or help people understand like what parts of AI are doing what, or like how does a human come into the loop. They have a ton of really great explorables, understanding like ML fairness and all this stuff too, that you can at least just like play around with and try to understand. They also have a bunch of tools and platforms like the Whatif tool and the language interpretability tool. And you can actually like open them up on GitHub and make your own version and all that stuff too, which I think is awesome. And yes, like I mentioned, if you haven't seen like the Whatif tool, like I guess this GIF truly doesn't do it justice because it's like very small, but you could like dive in deeper and be like, oh, how does an L1 versus L2 distance actually change, the outcome, or like, all this like fun stuff that we were talking about MATLAB earlier that would have taken a long time in MATLAB, but now you can like actually just see like how it's calculated and everything too. As well as like tools like the Teachable machine, which I think is great for designers to understand like, hey, how do I quickly understand like what a computer vision or camera model is doing, or any type of machine learning model. You could just make one yourself and see what's happening in the model, which I think is awesome. And things like embeddings projectors, this is also from TensorFlow, and like you can explore this or GitHub repo, fork it, and make your own kind of embeddings understanding thing too. Also, I have written up a bunch of resources. I'm just going to plug this one more time if folks are coming on the line late, but feel free to check out bit.ly/MLUX resources for how different companies are approaching this in terms of case studies, as well as some interactive visualizations. If you're a UX designer who wants to learn more about data science, I have some courses there for you too. So definitely check that out. And I've also shared a lot of the what is MLUX. So if you're at all interested in some of the examples I shared at the beginning, take a look at that. Oh yeah, have I mentioned I run a meetup? You should totally join. We talk about this type of stuff. It's great. So we're on Meetup, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube. We post our talks there if you ever want to see them there. And the last thing that I just kind of want to mention is that we are a part of the larger Feminist AI community. And right now we are fundraising for our 2021 programming. And so this is a free talk. I do everything external to Google for free. And we do a lot of events with them around like, hey, how do we get really cool examples out there about like reimagining AI for everybody. Some of our past programming has been like working with Dr. Sophia Noble, author of Algorithms of Oppression, for a community-based book club around how do local artists from the Women's Center for Creative Work in LA and the Black Women's Free Library understand and interpret her book, as well as like I have been doing tutorials for them too on like the Tone Transfer Project, just trying to get more people involved in AI and a more diverse and equitable future for AI. So if you are so inspired by this talk, imagine if all of us gave $5, we could really help do a lot of community programming. So check it out there. And thank you. Thank you. I'm also only one person right now, but there's like a bunch of people behind the scenes who actually help with a lot of this. So thank you to the MLUX team, all the folks who help write up everything, find speakers, all the stuff too. And thank you to you for listening. And so now we can take questions. Yeah. I see the only question. The only question is from Brian about like I support more giant floating heads in UIs. So awesome.
There's a question in the Q&A.
Okay, you.
Yeah, and yeah, I wanted to say thanks for the talk, and let's get to the Q&A question second. I wanted to get us started also on the explainability and trust part of the guidebook. I was really curious how you think about that, about like how to build trust with users for products that use data science or machine learning, and also how you've seen data scientists or machine learning engineers approach that, and similarities to UX researchers and how they think about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say one of the things that is really important about explainability or just like trust in general is like, don't position your AI as something it can't do. I think like that leads to a lot of distrust. And I know it's like hard, especially when you're building, I think chatbots are like one of the best examples of this. And I think all of us have probably encountered a customer service chatbot where at first we think it's a person because we're like, cool, they're taking a second to type. And then it's like, no, this is just like a dumb chatbot and like is not going to understand when I say return shipping label. And it's all like, I'm not quite sure about that. So like, being able to like be as clear as possible with like, hey, these are the types of things that it can do, and here's maybe the types of things that it can't do, or like features to build in the future, I think really helps manage those expectations about like, oh, it's really good for X, but maybe not Y. Yeah, I think like that's something that's really important. Also, like I think some folks, when I do think about or talk about or do research on explainability, sometimes it kind of gets into the space of like, oh, I need to like explain like what are the principal components of like why this is driving whatever, like for an unsupervised learning thing. And it's like, no, like truly like just giving them some level of detail as to like why they got this, or like even if that's like, I think I'm talking about recommenders because that tends to be a lot of ML these days is like recommender systems. But like imagine like you at least give some type of like, hey, we're giving you this because you recently purchased something else, or like they understand like, oh, because of my behavior in this way, that impacts other things that the algorithm's recommending, or like maybe I could turn off that setting or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
So we have a couple questions in the Q&A, and actually, Nathan, if you want to ask your question live, go ahead and unmute.
Thanks. Hey, Michelle, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. Hold on, I've accidentally opened up the Q&A and now I can't see anything. Oh, okay. Hi, Nathan. Hi.
Hi. My first question is regarding kind of the language and questions and prep that you do for users when you're doing user testing for ML-driven experiences. So I noticed you used the word model when you were describing it to us, and I'm curious if that, for example, is a word that you use when you're sitting down with a user. And do the users that you sit down with tend to be, real power users that have a pretty high level of understanding of ML concepts, or do you kind of prep people and say, this is what I mean when I say model, so that they, have a point of reference? And how have you seen that kind of shift as people's awareness of ML grows?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question, Nathan. And I think you stole part of my answer in your second question, which like, it depends. So it really depends on like what I'm testing and like who I'm testing it with. I think most of the time, just reflecting really quickly, I tend to use the word technology instead of model, because sometimes it's not even AI, like to be totally honest about like what's driving these. It feels like AI, but really it's just like a if statement or something, right? And I think it also helps people not go too much in that sci-fi space as well about like, oh, like AI, it's smart, it's artificial, it's intelligent, it should do all this stuff. It's more just like, nope, this is like a recommender app. Like, what does the technology do? And so like having them kind of stay grounded to that and like kind of bring in some other experiences, I think is really important. However, for this type of audience, I typically use model because then it's like, you're talking about ML and UX. The other part of your question around how I gauge it, like how I determine how much I explain to them. Sometimes I do some types of warm-up exercises too, where I actually have them brainstorm. Like, can you remember a couple times when you've used machine learning recently, or like where something was recommended to you, or like, so that way they can pull up some examples about like, especially if we're working in recommender systems, it might be something that just helps them be like, oh yeah, I actually am using machine learning a lot, from like the Google Maps thing, it auto-completed, or like that search result, or that image thing. And like maybe even asking them, sometimes especially in more of the early stage generative research, I ask them about where it's failed for them and what they've done about it. And then that kind of helps with the rest of the conversation too, instead of feeling so like stuck in like, oh, I've never encountered this before. It's like, well, but I did encounter something similar with like image search or something. So.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Andrew also had a question in the chat or in the Q&A if he wants to unmute and ask.
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'm Andrew. I'm on the algorithms team at Stitch Fix as well. And I had a question. I guess I was wondering if you've ever worked with like teams or organizations before to help kind of implement these types of processes and really get them thinking about how to design around AI. And if you have like worked with that, I don't know, or like maybe you've just gone and worked at places where you've always done this stuff. But if not, then like what are the, I guess, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered in getting orgs to like shift?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I wish I had a very clean answer. Yeah, if you figure out the secret sauce, please also let me know. But I think a lot of the times there is still this mental model of like, and this gets into like organizational psychology and like incentive structures and stuff too, of like, yes, like here you do ML and you do design, and like those are separate things, and like design takes the handoff from ML. But like I think citing case studies, I think Spotify does it really well, where they have like, instead of like a separate ML team entirely, it's like by product feature, and like embedded are the designers and data scientists, and like they're actively doing research and sharing back to each other, and it's like smaller pods rather than like separate teams. I think is a pretty good structure for this type of like very early stage in testing ML early and often. So I have found success in like using those. This is one of the reasons why I added them at like the top of the MLUX resource list, because I think they have a couple of really cool case studies that are like really easy to kind of like send to leadership and be like, hey, I saw this. Could we try it like with this project? That might be cool. Also, the more examples that you have, the easier it becomes. So something even as lightweight as like a hackathon or something too has been really beneficial for like me to kind of prove like, hey, if we do research early on, we can get better results for the ML model. Like and it doesn't have to take like 2 months or something. It could just be like a week of time, and we get something that we can already test and then determine if we want to go ahead and build it or kill it, right? So yeah, the last thing that I would say too is I've actually encountered some, I'm not going to say, maybe hesitation is the best word, by some designers. I think I've mentioned this before, but I code, and like that was like my scholastic background and education. But like I have definitely gotten feedback from some designers of like, whoa, I chose design because I don't want to ever touch any code. And so like, I think by having better user interfaces just for like, or even just like ways of communicating, like tools to communicate like the findings of the models, rather than just jumping straight into like a Colab notebook or IPython notebook, or sorry, Jupyter notebook. Like I think we forget as like data scientists how jarring that might be to suddenly be like, oh wait, you're sharing code with me. I have no idea what's going on. But like, I know I just go straight to the visualizations. I'm like, here, like this is the thing. And they're like, whoa, there was a lot of code on the screen. So like the easier that you can make it to kind of all be speaking the same language, and like, you know, having that shared vocabulary, the quicker that you can like help kind of steer the ship, I think, towards like, hey, these are really great examples of this, and celebrating those really good examples of like teams coming together, I think is awesome.
That was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me know how it goes. Don't be a stranger.
Definitely won't be.
Yay.
We also have a question from Catherine. So if she's interested in asking live, I've given her permission to talk.
Cool.
It sounds
Hi,
very
Catherine.
authoritarian.
Oh, hey, that was a surprise. I'm just interested to know how you get from the surveys and the qualitative feedback you're getting. How do you get from there to a hard metric that you're going to put in your machine learning model, like your precision or your recall? Do you have any thoughts or resources around that process?
Yeah, it's kind of like a heuristic. It's like, well, I think it also depends on like what team you're working on and what company. I think like this is one of the downsides of this travel app is like, before I worked at Google, I was actually at Amazon, and it's like, well, what data can we get like from the music side and like all this stuff too. One exercise you can do is, I actually got this from the Trust, Transparency, and Control workshop from Facebook, but they actually list out a bunch of different data sources, and you can kind of be like, can we actually get this or not? Or like, is this something that people are expecting to get or not? So like understanding all these kind of like, what is like what are the possible worlds, and like, does this actually make sense to have this inform this type of ML recommendation or ML model or whatever that is, or would it make more sense to keep it simple or something like that? It depends. And like, it could be also something that comes from like, hey, you know, if on this app, everyone has to make an account. And so like we have their first time, you know, account thing where they list their interests. Maybe we use that for the model and then we ask them to update that and give feedback over time. So yeah, does that kind of help?
It definitely helps. Yeah, this talk has given me a lot of things to think about. So really appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, my pleasure. And please feel free to tweet at me or whatever if you have any other questions or figure it out. I would love that. So.
I also have a question, Michelle. So
hi, Brian.
Hey, I give myself permission to talk now. So there's this idea in machine learning of like these ablation studies where you kind of like, you're trying to understand the model or the architecture better by purposely removing pieces of it and then seeing how the performance is impacted. And sometimes I've wondered about in the like, and what made me think of this was when you were talking about like your user research and kind of like trying to get them to communicate things like, this is what they were expecting, this is what they saw, this is how it made them feel. I started getting this like, this question, which I've had before, of kind of like, how do you pull out the components that are really having the positive effects or they're really resonating? Like, what is this version of an ablation study for sort of like this user research? I don't know. It's a little bit of a fuzzy question.
Yeah, no, Brian, I really appreciate that question. I never thought of a ablation, but for UXR. I think, so what I try to do with like every, as I wrap up the study is like, is there one thing that stood out to you that you would want to change? Or like, is there one part of this that, you know, you would want to see now? Like if we could put it in the app tomorrow, like, especially if I'm working on something that's already an existing feature, but I'm just like tweaking a little bit of it of like, you saw a lot of different design things, like what would be like the one thing you'd want to have implemented? I think that kind of gets at like the, they tend to answer what it is and why. And I think that kind of gets at like the big driver. However, like, you know, also putting on your UXR hat, sometimes people say things and then that's not actually how they would behave. So like, I think the classic one is like, yes, everyone wants everything customizable. And then it's like the Walmart website is now hot pink for some people and lime green for others. And you're like, wait, why? Like, this doesn't make any sense. So like, so being sure that you're asking things in like a mindful way that like can actually lead to like the underlying goals and motivations more than just like the feature, I think is going to be like a key indicator. However, tying that back to the actual metrics is really can be difficult sometimes. So, but starting with like those overall like goals, like what is your goal here? Like that kind of thing, it can be a good like rule of thumb.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Also, this has been great, and I really appreciate you answering our questions and coming to talk to us today. Thanks again.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for the great questions. And yes, feel free if you want to say hi, Michelle at MLUXSF.com or tweet at me. Yeah, feel free to come to a future event as well. Hopefully see you around.
Awesome.